Welcome back to Ivanti's Security Insights, where best practice cybersecurity meets real-world workplaces and roadblocks. I'm your host, Ashley Stryker, and with us today is our OG host with the most, Chris Goettl, and of course, our CSO, Daniel Spicer, and our Deputy CSO, Amanda Wittern. Did I say your last name right, Amanda?
You did, yes.
Oh, good, because I've only been spelling it for weeks now, and I haven't actually had to say it out loud yet. Now that we've gotten Daniel and Amanda both on at the same time, which is like ridiculously exciting, yay! We kind of wanted to take a moment to step back to the very first episode, where I appeared anyway, because I've been kind of anxious to get back to this, and it had to do with Microsoft's disclosure sort of repercussions at Black Hat and DEF CON this past fall. And I kind of wanted to start the conversation here with Chris. As kind of a quick refresher here, can you talk a little bit about the difference between a coordinated disclosure and a responsible disclosure? Because that kind of gets at the heart of who all we're talking about and what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we started talking about the last episode where we got into this is, the topic of when and how should vendors be disclosing vulnerability information to their customers. So a responsible disclosure is, a lot of times you've got multiple parties involved with any type of vulnerability disclosure. Responsible disclosure is when those parties are acting together in closed channels where they're coordinating or they're responsibly controlling the conversation and not disclosing information to the public that can put their customers at risk. So that's kind of the kind of base example of responsible disclosure. So if whether it's a customer finds a vulnerability in a pen test that they're doing, a third-party researcher might be investigating something, they are taking the conversation directly to the vendor that they found the vulnerability with, maybe even multiple vendors, depending on how it was, put together, the vulnerability attack or whatever they were demonstrating. They are trying to make sure to work with that vendor then to make sure it gets resolved in a timely fashion. And that once it is resolved, then making sure that information, the right level of information gets out to the public. Now, a coordinated disclosure is kind of the superset. A coordinated disclosure is where, again, you've got the person who found the vulnerability, you've got the vendor who's involved. You may have multiple other additional parties. Maybe there was a pen tester that the customer that found it was contracting in at the time. Maybe it's a federal entity and they've got to bring in, some of their security umbrella because those parties need to be responsible, whether it's like CISA or DISA or somebody along those lines. The coordinated disclosure process becomes a lot heavier. It's making sure that all the information is communicated out to all the right parties in advance, that revealing of that information is done in a coordinated and timely fashion, and that all parties are sharing, the same and, adequate level of information out to the public. The thing that, responsible disclosure is trying to avoid is giving information to threat actors before the vendor or any other customers have an ability to respond to or mitigate issues. What coordinated disclosure is trying to do is to get a kind of maximized preparedness for all parties involved to really try to make sure that you're reducing that risk of exposure. Because really, once a vulnerability becomes identified, whether it's a public disclosure, private disclosure, a really well done coordinated disclosure, at the time where that information is revealed, the clock starts ticking. A threat actor now knows that there's a change that's been made. They can go in, reverse engineer where those changes occurred, and they can work their way back into what was that vulnerability and how might they take advantage of it. And that process can happen very quickly. We've seen, if you look at Bluekeep, that's an example I've used on previous episodes. We actually got to look at that example very publicly because multiple research firms were researching it simultaneously. It was exactly 14 days from when the update was first made available to plug that vulnerability until they were able to reverse engineer, and 6 different research firms had confirmed exploits, full, system level privileges within that 14-day time period. So once that clock starts, organizations have to, potentially scramble to plug something if it's particularly nasty. So that's kind of responsible disclosure, is making sure that the parties that I've identified and the vendor that the vulnerability is in are working together to respond to it. Coordinated disclosure is the more rigorous process to effectively make sure that all parties have the right information and disclose together so that we don't create an unfair advantage for threat actors.
My understanding, though, based on our conversation in a previous episode with Daniel, was that this was not the Microsoft's Ninja patch of their cloud product was not necessarily a great example of a coordinated disclosure, because it, in fact, didn't happen publicly. So my understanding, Daniel, is that part of this situation kind of prompted us at Ivanti to actually do an exercise kind of around disclosures. And you said you based it off of the prisoner's dilemma?
Yeah, absolutely. So to geek out just a little bit, I'm a big fan of economic theory and especially game theory, and applying that to information security in order to verify models and be able to actually run through the processes that we need to in order to make sure that we as a company are following best practices. And so game theory really helps with tabletop exercises, and it helps validate the decisions that we're making in terms of policies and procedures on how we handle things, including a coordinated disclosure. And so the prisoner's dilemma is a very well-known game where you have two players or agents in official game speak language, two players who are forced to make a decision on whether or not to cooperate. And there is a mixture of level responses depending on who wants who cooperate, whether both parties cooperate or neither parties cooperate, has different outcomes for different players. And in most cases, we run this kind of solution to help figure out how to influence the players to cooperate, much like a coordinated disclosure, right? We want all players, in order to ensure the protection of the applicable system or product that has an issue, and all the customers that use that solution, and all the parties involved in the coordinated disclosure, to be encouraged to participate in the coordinated disclosure in order to have the best possible outcome.
A real world example of what he's talking about is the classic two criminals are taken for interrogation separately, and both told that if they rat out the other, they will get less time. If neither say anything, they get off scot-free. If one rats out the other, they get less time. If they both rat out, they both get the maximum time. So in Daniel's explanation, it's like introducing a lawyer who talks to both parties and says, these are the benefits, these are your rights. You should absolutely consider these things and see the bigger picture and how you both come out on top by working together.
Yeah, so you can find live examples on all kinds of different crime shows. There's a few game shows now that have it, or my favorite, I think it's the beginning of season 5 of Archer. You get to see a multi-party game play out, which is actually what we have here, right? When we talk about multiple parties, as Amanda said, the traditional is just two players, but in a coordinated disclosure, as we kind of talked about, there are many different players in many different places here.
So in this scenario, let's talk a little bit about the players that we're going to be talking about. There's the vendor, whose product the vulnerability has been discovered in, right? There's the researcher or pen tester, whoever they might be, who discovered the vulnerability. In this case, we might have other players who might be an infrastructure vendor. There could be another security third party or managed service provider. There could be a lot of additional parties in here, but our two primaries are still the vendor and the researcher, right?
No, I would actually argue that any game that you play involving a coordinated disclosure actually has three parties. You're missing the customer. The customer is one of the most important parties here, because you want to make sure that you're considering, even if they don't know about the vulnerability, you want to make sure you're considering their reaction to the way the coordinated disclosure is going to work. Three core parties, and then there's a bunch of additional parties that could be related.
Okay, so now the motivation of this exercise, let's back up to the example that started this all. Microsoft took a little bit of heat for some vulnerabilities that were responsibly disclosed between the researcher and Microsoft, but were not provided in a coordinated disclosure out to their customers. So that third party, the customer, was left in the dark that there was actually a vulnerability that was fixed in that case, but responsible disclosure still occurred. So in this case, it was a cloud-based vulnerability. And I think, Daniel, the crux of the issue is Microsoft's argument for why they didn't do a coordinated disclosure was there was nothing for you, Mr. Customer, to do. We already took care of you. The vulnerability was disclosed to us. It was disclosed securely, privately. No information was leaked out. We were able to resolve it in infrastructure. So Microsoft had no motivation to tell the customer in that case because there was nothing for them to do, is their argument, right?
So that's the argument. And again, I get to play both sides as a product vendor and as a product customer, right? That's not necessarily the case, though. And again, coordinated disclosure is not just when you release the vulnerability. There are a bunch of steps that happen after a vulnerability has been announced. And as a customer, one of those is, was I impacted by the vulnerability, right? What is my risk? What was my exposure? Was it exploited? Do I need to do an IR, right? So I think that is actually a little short-sighted, Chris.
Based on our prisoner's dilemma exercise then, as a vendor and seeing how Microsoft didn't handle it especially well, is there a point at which everyone can be pleased? I mean, there are dozens upon dozens of people and parties involved, and different considerations to be made and different arguments clearly to be made on both sides. And the community felt that Microsoft erred, but was it possible to have avoided angering at anybody? Could we have pleased everyone? Could they have pleased everyone with this instance?
So I would argue that it's impossible to please everyone during a coordinated disclosure. And I'll start that by saying nobody's pleased about a vulnerability existing in the first place, right?
That's fair. That's fair.
Nobody's actually happy about that. But as we ran through our exercise internally, one of the things that became very apparent is the complexity of the players. For a lot of smaller firms, especially in the threat intelligence place or in the penetration testing space, finding a big vulnerability is a huge marketing event for them. And even as an individual, that adds to your resume and your clout as a vulnerability researcher, as a red teamer. And so, when we talk about game theory, we're trying to convince the parties to cooperate and shift what's called Nash equilibrium by adding certain incentives to certain players to make it more likely that they will cooperate. And so bug bounties are actually a really good incentive to help certain parties cooperate, but it's not perfect. And actually, I'll talk about a common stance in the red team is my responsible disclosure process is you, vendor, have 60, 90, 30, whatever, depends on the person, days to fix and announce this, or I'm going to release my information anyways. And that's actually taken a stance because a lot of vendors ignored responsible disclosures for so long that red teamers feel like they have the right to put a deadline without actually understanding the complexity of some of the fixes. So there's kind of some complicated personas in the game that we're playing here. And it makes it very difficult to actually carry out a successful coordinated disclosure.
Yeah, I think there's some good examples on that. Like a couple of really big ones are when, suddenly you have to re-architect how authentication works. So Microsoft is in the process of, sunsetting basic authentication right now. Most organizations needed a really long runway before Microsoft was able to shut that off. So regardless of how much information Microsoft or researchers may have had about the ways that basic auth was no longer secure and the limitations of it, there's a lot of runway before we can just, plug a vulnerability real quick in some cases. Just shutting that off could have broken many organizations' business critical applications. So I think Daniel's right. There's no way to make everybody happy, but there is a way to maybe not leave happy, but save face in the process. And I think that's really the part that Microsoft walks a line. Like you can see, to Daniel's point, a lot of researchers, they want the feather in their cap. They want to show that what their security chops are. They want the references in a Microsoft CVE or in a disclosure that they blogged about or information like that, because it lends them credibility in their space. But if they do that without doing that responsible disclosure with the vendor and letting the vendor actually respond and provide the right level of update and detail, they're putting all of us at risk. So, there has to be an equilibrium. Otherwise, we'll continue to have these cases where an extreme happens. A threat researcher gets unhappy and discloses the information and puts everybody on that product or platform at risk. A vendor acknowledges the responsible disclosure, but then doesn't do the coordinated disclosure to actually inform customers. To Daniel's point, if there was a fix, how does Daniel and his team know if they were exposed or not, if they never knew that the vulnerability was there and was resolved? Was it there? Was it there for 3 months? Was it there for 6 years? What were the patterns they could look for to determine how, if they were compromised? Those are all important things that the customer in that case needs, or they don't have enough information to know that they were secure.
And then you have liability issues too. I bet. I wonder what would happen and if anybody could claim responsibility if they got hacked by somebody using that exploit that had been responsibly disclosed but not publicly coordinated disclosed. Like that is really, that's intricate. Amanda, I wanted to toss this to you too. Did you have any other components of complexities of the people we're dealing with here?
I want to make sure that we aren't vilifying our researchers and our
That's fair.
our red team, right? The things that Chris talked about are incentives that motivate them to find these in the first place. And we want to make sure that as we're having this conversation, they certainly have a very important role to play, and we are glad that they have those incentives. It's really just part of this prisoner's dilemma to provide them with an incentive for delaying some of these rewards that they're seeking after, right? I mean, they may be good people, but it's not altruistic, right? But nonetheless, that's really where the challenge is, right? Sometimes it's very clear how you can benefit individually. It's about that communication and presenting ways that you can benefit collectively. And that's not always clear and easy to identify.
You said communication, and that seems to be a thread in all of the different pieces of this with all of the different considerations. Red team feels like they're entitled to put a time limit on it because they weren't told or taken seriously or felt heard. The companies feel like they weren't given enough time in order to actually the reporters don't understand the complexities of a patch and don't understand the timetables that all of these different customers are on in order to move on to that. And I bet you customers often don't understand the need and the urgency for changing things from how they've previously done it. So it seems like communication in a way that each of the parties understand seems to be the common thread there. So how would you, and I guess then, what would a best of all worlds, since you can't please everyone, but you can at least let people save face and walk some sort of line, how would a coordinated disclosure of a similar cloud product look like for a vulnerability revealing, keeping in mind communication is kind of that key?
At Ivanti, who we like to think we're implementing the best possible practices. So I'll talk a little bit about what we exactly. I'll talk a little bit about what we try to do and how our processes and procedures are written here. So for a cloud-based vulnerability, we still feel like it's important to notify customers that there was an issue and try to make sure they understand the potential impact and the risk to their organization should there be some kind of issue in our cloud products. So that means we would release a security advisory. What we would not release and not provide is a CVE. Our personal feeling is that a CVE helps customers understand that there is some sort of action that they need to take in order to resolve the vulnerability. And we talked about this a little bit on the last episode, right? So in the case that we had to, if it was a component that was customer hosted or there was some action that a customer had to do to adjust their configuration, a CVE is totally appropriate. But if Ivanti, as part of our work, can resolve the issue without any customer intervention, we would release a security advisory to inform our customers, but we wouldn't release that CVE because there is no action and no reason to track the vulnerability through the NVD. We would still want to keep good lines of communications with the reporter. We'd want to let the reporter take credit within the security advisory. Ivanti actually tries to offer the opportunity for reporters who do properly operate within our responsible disclosure to receive credit from Ivanti, and not just in the terms of a potential bug bounty, a cash reward, but also giving them credit publicly for assisting Ivanti and protecting our customers, which is super important to us. And then, of course, as long as we're maintaining that communication, once we are patched and resolved, once the SA goes out, then the reporter is free to share their research and how they found it. And we still think that is still important. A lot of, it depends on who you talk to, right? But a lot of red teamers are a little bit too focused on the rewards and the notoriety that comes with the publication. When I look at the value of the publications, I read researchers' publications not because I want to hire them as a pen tester, but because I want to figure out how to make sure my engineers do not make the same mistakes and my pen testers are educated on how to make sure this issue doesn't end up in my product. So we still encourage to share those lessons learned publicly. And we don't see that as a negative. We see that as a net positive for the security community as a whole, so long as a coordinated disclosure is followed the entire way.
How has the public response? I have no idea, for complete transparency here, I have no idea if this has ever been implemented. I had no idea what the details of this policy were. This is not just when you have shared this with public people, regardless of whether or not there was a security advisory or a CVE that was disclosed as part of Ivanti's program, just presenting this to red teamers in the community as this is how we would like to go about it. What's kind of been the response?
Unfortunately, we don't get a lot of feedback on a responsible disclosure policy or procedure until there's a responsible disclosure. Yeah. Well, but that's not uncommon. we do have a lot of people who come and ask for our responsible disclosure policy. It's a bit unfortunate, but most of the people who ask for that are basically trying to figure out what the bounty payouts are to see if it's worth their effort to work with us. They're not as interested in the process itself. So that's a little disappointing. But I do share with other members of the security community and some of my peers and in contacts I have. That feedback's been great. There are obviously different ways of tackling this, but this is how Ivanti's currently tackling it right now.
From the product side, I'm on the product management side. The customers, they are interested in making sure that Ivanti has good security practices, and that if issues happen, they know where and how they're going to get that information, and that we are being responsible in coordinating and disclosing that information to them. So these activities, I can tell you from a product perspective, the customers that I engage with, they are asking these questions as they're purchasing our products, as they're renewing our products. They want to make sure that the vendors that they're doing business with are being responsible about that. So having a program like this has net benefits in a variety of ways. It establishes trust with your customer. It does, show that you're being responsive to vulnerabilities that are discovered within your platform. If there's ever a vendor out there that has no vulnerabilities in it, well, chances are it's just because they're not telling you about it, or they're really, really not looking into it at all. But software in general is just, there's bugs, there's vulnerabilities. It's the nature of software. It constantly needs evaluation and correction. So, I think overall, both the product and the security side of Ivanti are in agreement that we want to continue to have a good responsible disclosure process within Ivanti, and make sure that our customers know how they're going to get that coordinated disclosure whenever we do have one, or a security advisory.
We have a theme here, right, of communication being really integral in this. And I have this saying that, in fact, I told Daniel this today, that communication is getting a point across to someone. How you get there is irrelevant, right? And so I think there is a very important component of communication in this, and that is action, right? In our Microsoft example, there was they did not act. They did not do things that seem to be in the best interest of their customers, and there's a level of trust there. And so, as part of this process, it's really important that every party have an action, right, and do the right thing. That is absolutely imperative for everyone to have faith that this works, that we are keeping in mind both our own interests as well as the impact that it has to our customers and our vendors, and even our red team, our researchers. So super, super critical that as part of that communication, we do the right thing.
And I think that's a great place to pause then this discussion. And I'm sure somebody somewhere will have another disclosure event where we can reopen this particular can of worms and see how we would have done it better. But in the meantime, thank you guys so much for joining us today. If you'd like to continue today's conversation, including if you've ever run a similar exercise of figuring out incentive programs for your own programs, or flip side, if you're a customer who's had to deal with handling CVEs and security advisories, what do you think of this program? We don't hear a lot from the people asking, but boy, we'd love to hear from other people and see if you've got any ideas for us to incorporate. Please do join us online at Twitter and LinkedIn at Go Ivanti. That's Go IVANTI. Please check out the show notes for all links to all of the mentioned resources and several others that would play a great role in this conversation, especially if you're thinking about how do you handle different types of vulnerabilities on a risk-based management kind of perspective. And if you found today's conversation at all remotely interesting, educational, and or vaguely entertaining, which I'm hoping all three, please take a second, grab the link, share it with a teammate, a coworker, a friend, anybody you think would find value in it. The more people who listen to us, the more the algorithm likes us, and we can reach out to more InfoSec people like yourself. So with that, we're all signing off. So stay safe, everyone, and we'll talk soon. Bye.